Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Bill. Two straight shooters, refreshing. Up at the mic. Happy now that we're moving into our final segment of the program on global development challenges and solutions, which features folks who are real movers and shakers in the world of sustainable development. We're happy to have Helene, Gayle, CEO of McKinsey Social Initiative, Eric Postel from USAID, and Craig Steffensen from the Asian Development Bank. The segment's going to be moderated by Scott Morris, who has been a committee member since he left his days at Treasury and is now a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. He's also director of their Rethinking U.S. Development Policy initiative that seeks to broaden the U.S. government's approach to development. And he works on issues related to the IFIs, and particularly the relationship between the IFIs and the United States. So with that, Scott, I'll leave it to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Randy. Let me start with format. We're going to be having a conversation here, not formal remarks from the podium. I want to briefly introduce what is an excellent panel. I'm really pleased and looking forward to hearing their insights on the broad topic of global development. I'm going to try my best to do a few minutes of framing of the issues before I turn to them for some questions, and then turn to you all for some questions. So let me start to my left. Eric Postel, Associate Administrator for the United States Agency for International Development, confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2011. And prior to his service as a senior official in this administration, really a distinguished career in the private sector and really doing development finance from the private side, and in a way that really speaks to, I think, how AID today is evolving and seeking to change in its approach to what we traditionally would think of as foreign assistance, but really is better cast more broadly as development policy. Dr. Helene Gayle, newly CEO of the McKinsey Social Initiative. And looking forward to hearing more about that and the model that underlies this. And comes to McKinsey following a very successful tenure as CEO of CARE, a leading humanitarian organization. Before that, leadership positions at the CDC, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and service on a broad array of boards and commissions. And finally, Craig Steffensen, who has the challenging task of representing the Asian Development Bank here in Washington, both the United States and Canada, but from where I sit, with the U.S. focus, a lot on his plate in the engagement with the U.S. government, and particularly at a time, and we'll talk more about this, but at a time for the multilateral development banks and the Asian Development Bank in particular of change, of a shifting landscape of new actors. And Craig is really central in the U.S. engagement and all of that. Prior to that position, really an impressive career at the bank, including leading engagements in areas as challenging themselves as Afghanistan, and recently the bank's re-engagement with Myanmar. Really an interesting case. So those are our impressive speakers, and really impressive both not only in their own backgrounds, but the diversity that they represent in this development enterprise, and I hope we can explore more of that. So let me just try to, in say 2 minutes, try to lay out what I see as big issues in the development landscape, and hope to get your reactions as a first question on this set of issues. And I do want to say, because this is Bretton Woods, that it's important, and perhaps this sounds a little defensive, but we are, after all, sitting in the IMF, not at the World Bank this morning. But it is important to remember and recognize that development was a core mandate at Bretton Woods. It is the D in IBRD that emerged from the Bretton Woods Conference, and it's been a consistent element over 7 decades now. So, entirely fitting that we're here talking about the development agenda among other issues today. But let me start by trying to create a little bit of a laundry list, and I've organized these issues in 3 areas. From a policy perspective, we've had really a landmark set of new commitments in the last few years, well, specifically last year, with the Sustainable Development Goals and the major commitments reflected there. In the same year, you had major commitments around climate. And very much an understanding in the international community that these issues are linked and have to be approached jointly. At the same time, you had a commitment, I've already alluded to launch a new multilateral development bank in the form of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And while it is regional in nature, it has a global membership, and that is very meaningful. Members from Latin America, Europe, Africa, notably not a member in the form of the United States. We see new risks and new challenges in the development landscape. Very visibly, the refugee crisis associated with Syria. We've had pandemic threats in the last few years that have caused us to really think hard about policy responses and impact on development. We certainly see economic headwinds. We've heard a lot of that conversation already this morning, even what it means for developing countries, whether low-income countries or emerging market, very real threats going forward. And associated with that, whether you want to interpret Brexit from that side of things, what it will do for the flow of goods and services, for the developing world, for things like remittances, that are just a hugely important part of development finance for many of these countries, but also reflected in Brexit a real question about political retreat from globalization at a time when developing countries themselves are perhaps benefiting more than ever from integration. And then finally, not to be entirely negative, really looking at new opportunities represented in the global landscape today when it comes to development progress. And here, I think well known to the development community, but the nature of finance today, where you have really tremendous sources of private finance flowing to the developing world and really within the developing world, including on the public side. The size of domestic resource mobilization today compared to what it has been historically, all of these things point to real progress, but also raise questions about what the role of traditional foreign assistance is going forward. Remarkable success in poverty reduction. What we've heard is sort of what continues to be an anchor for institutions like the World Bank. Also the reality that we have made tremendous progress, and what does that look like going forward? And then finally, again, thinking about the role of our development institutions, both the question of how they are adapting, but also to recognize that they are adapting. I think we'll hear more about this from Eric, but our own development agency, which happens to be the largest development actor, bilateral development actor, has been very actively reforming itself in recent years. We're seeing it in the MDB community, both at the World Bank across the street and institutions like the Asian Development Bank, the creation of new institutions. And then finally, I think outside of this official sector, really seeing very interesting new models that seek to exploit the capital, the expertise, resources of the private sector but to do so under a not-for-profit model, and I think we'll hear more about that as well. So that's my 2 minutes or so on a tour of the global landscape for development. Let me turn with the basic question for our panelists, and you can either approach it as an optimist, a pessimist, or maybe just a problem solver, but what do you see as either the issue that is too much overlooked or most consequential going forward when it comes to global development today, and what should we be thinking about as major opportunity, major challenge? So let me start with you, Eric, and we'll just go down the row.
Thanks, Scott, and good morning, everyone. Is it on?
Yeah.
There. Good morning, everyone. As you said, there's a lot of change going on around the world and a lot of opportunities, and some people have think about the SDGs as sort of a follow-on from the MDGs, and of course they are, but I don't think it's business as usual, as you said yourself, because there are new things, new challenges, and obviously youth bulge, climate change, those are two of them, but one of the ones that's really a challenge involves what we call DRG, democracy, rights, and governance, because you see closing spaces in countries where they're basically shutting down NGOs from operating. You're seeing restrictions of freedoms and openness. And that sounds sort of in the weeds, but we've seen where these things can lead to conflict. And the conflict then leads to big, big problems that even hit the macro scene with the migration as one of the most dramatic examples. Don't need to spell out all the implications of that given the last few days. So I see DRG as one of the drivers of these problems and an area that is very difficult for anybody to challenge and solve, but nonetheless extremely important for everybody to work on together.
Great.
Yeah, and thanks for that kind of framing of all the issues. I think first and foremost, what the SDGs have done for the global community, I think, is tremendous, because I think it does give us a framework. And as you said, it's more than just an add-on to the Millennium Development Goals. I think it is really a new paradigm, and even the way they were created created a different kind of dialogue around those. So first and foremost, I think, continuing to say that that's our framework and that's kind of our guiding overarching blueprint for what we think about as we tackle the challenges of the world going forward. And I guess to your point of being optimist, pessimist, I kind of go back and forth between both of those. I think there's an incredible amount to be optimistic about. I think the fact that we have decreased poverty, that disease rates are going down, that education rates are going up, et cetera, is incredibly hopeful. But I do think that there are some things, and some of them are embedded within the SDGs, and then some are not as clearly called out. So the issue of income inequality, yes, in fact, poverty has been reduced, and more poor people now live in middle-income countries, but the inequality both within and among nations continues to increase. And I think that that is going to continue to define our world for the foreseeable future. And if we don't think about that, we're going to continue to have some of the consequences that we're already feeling in terms of the conflict that arises. I think the other one, and you touched on it, is this whole issue of migration and migratory populations. This is only going to get bigger, more complicated, and I think we haven't thought enough about the solutions to the reality. We all wish migration, refugee crises, et cetera, would go away and that we could solve them. The reality is we are going to have a larger and larger portion of our population who will not be in their home country, and we're going to have to think about jobs and education, and what does that mean to really think about adapting the way we do business for people who are displaced from their home countries. The only other one I would just say that I think is both a reason for optimism, but also one for caution, and that's the issue of gender equity, and that's called out in the SDGs. I think it is one of the most hopeful opportunities that we have for making a difference in the world. If we just do the things that it takes to make sure that we have gender equity in our world across the board, whether it's workplace, whether it's in policies, leadership positions, what have you, we could dramatically change the outcomes, economic outcomes, peace, security, stability, et cetera. So, I think that that's incredibly optimistic, because in a very simple solution, we could have a huge impact. The difficult part is that we know that we have been talking about how do we change the status and value of girls and women around our world, and we know that we are still having a difficult time doing that. So a lot of optimism around it. On the other hand, I think we still have a ways to go.
Great.
Thanks, Scott. The list of development priorities that the multilateral development banks, ADB included, are looking at is long. For example, the way we see the world today, there's a need to create jobs for the increasing number of young people. The development community, the banks included, are going to have to really focus on helping out with job creation and improved workplace conditions by supporting education and skills development for youth, particularly young women, and to help promote core labor standards. On top of this, there's a need, as was already stated, to enhance gender equity under our development projects and in the communities we serve. The private sector is an area that requires strengthening on our part, on everyone's part, especially to develop new and innovative financing in support of the activities we fund, and to come up with new technologies for doing so. ADB, I'll limit my remarks here to ADB. We need to come up with ways to improve our project implementation and disbursement so that we can deliver projects and outcomes faster. I think particularly with the rise of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank and the new Development Bank, it's a more competitive market than it used to be. And I know how much ADB's president, Jin Kun, my former boss, is just how much emphasis he puts on project delivery in time frames that are, well, one, responsible, but two, sort of respond to the political imperatives of doing things quickly. Along the same line, I think the banks need to come up with an improved pipeline of projects. There's, in Asia anyway, a shortage of bankable projects in development, which directly affect the MDB's ability to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and to address other development needs. And the limited flow of bankable projects represents a major obstacle to public-private partnerships, which everyone is promoting nowadays, particularly in infrastructure development. This is a really urgent need, that is to come up with a pipeline of bankable projects. I could go on. I mean, there's a whole issue of aging populations and demographic change, the needs for improved pension and poverty, provident funds reform, the whole inequality and inclusiveness agenda, refugees, the Zika virus, global pandemics. We're trying to deal with all of them at the same time. It's not easy, but I think that we're doing the best we can, and I think we've got a pretty good history of sort of responding to these challenges in a way that makes sense.
Great. So I want to stick with the SDGs, and particularly the big picture of the SDGs for a minute. And Eric, a question to you. I sit at the Center for Global Development, a bunch of development experts, far more expert, frankly, than I see myself on a lot of these issues. But they bring a critical eye to this exercise from a number of standpoints. But one thing that's striking about it, as I listen to them and read myself, is this is a complex agenda. And if you compare it to the Millennium Development Goals, which in a way more reflected a traditional approach in thinking about development, and particularly the role of foreign assistance actors. So you think about, USAID's role, the role of the US government more broadly, much of the MDGs were really about how do we allocate our funds directly to support maternal health, et cetera. The SDGs are casting a wider and more complicated net. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, whether you want to hook it directly to the SDGs, but how is USAID as an institution thinking about itself these days that is different from a very traditional role of foreign assistance provider? And from your leadership perspective, for 5 years now, how do you think about helping to meet a set of goals that isn't primarily about how you spend your own money directly? It's about your partnerships and relationships. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So I'll say a couple different things. I would say that the SDGs were not an action forcing event for us in terms of the changes that we've been going through, because our changes have predated the SDGs. But the SDGs reflect several different things. And the most succinct way I could describe it is that basically we're the minority partner now in the development and exercise. And I would argue, though some might disagree, that actually all the official development agencies are the minority partner. And this, you can see this just in the numbers, in the flow of funds, in the fact that NGOs and others are providing just as much money or more. I mean, Gates Foundation is what, about greater than the French official development, if I remember the ranking. You have private sector investment in countries that 30 years ago when I went to business school, they never would have dreamed of thinking about, and now they all are. You have remittances and other things. So the fundamental driver, I think, for a lot of things was the fact that we're the minority partner, which leads you to a really different mindset. It's partly about partnerships. It's partly about innovation. I mean, back when USAID was formed, and there were very few courses on development around this country. Now, the course at Berkeley that has the highest single attendance is the development course. 900 kids a year, a semester, taking that course. And you have kids in high school and college setting up their own NGOs and traveling around the world. And nowadays, everyone from many top business schools all spend time in developing countries. And you have huge amounts of innovation. The development breakthroughs are not necessarily coming out of development agencies or their partners. I mean, when we did our grand challenge on Ebola to deal with the fact that that suit that everyone uses was so hot in West Africa, the resulting design that will enable people to work longer and staying in the suit included a Baltimore dress seamstress, a New York City fashion designer, and DuPont. I mean, that is an amazing collection of people, and that's now going into production for use in these hot climates. So when you start thinking through the implications, also obviously vis-a-vis our relationship with the private sector is hugely transformed when you think of yourself more as the minority partner in the exercise. So that's part of all the changes. To me, on the SDG side, there is a lot of traditional development in there. The goals on energy or health or education, all of those things are in sectors where all of the bilaterals and the MDBs have been working, for decades. But there's a wider number, obviously. And then the final few SDGs talk heavily in terms of the idea of partnership and good governance and things like that. So you have that expansion. So in some ways, I think it will be business as usual, and in other ways, it will profoundly not be business as usual.
So, Helene, you emphasize the issue of migration and particularly the challenges of displacement. So in the category of not business as usual, let me ask you a little bit more about that. So it does seem, so you've had this very visible tragic situation playing out in our newspapers. And there's always a silver lining of something like that, is it brings more attention to an issue that didn't occur overnight. And in fact, displacement has been with us in many parts of the world for a long time. And I think with more attention being paid now, we're starting to understand better the nature of displacement, that it is not strictly or simply a short-term crisis, that it actually is long-term in nature for many of these populations and for the countries that are hosting them. So I wonder if, you've been a leader in the humanitarian sector. You have a new venture that has more of a development focus to it. Can you speak a little bit to that nexus of thinking about issues that, on the one hand, are humanitarian crises, but really have longer-term development implications, and how we should be thinking differently about our approaches, whether it is specifically displaced populations or other types of disruption from conflicts, crisis?
Yeah, thanks. And Eric kind of touched on it in some of his earlier comments, but I think those of us who are working in this space between humanitarian and development realize that more and more that needs to be thought of as a continuum. And it used to be, an organization like CARE, for instance, that used to be primarily humanitarian and crisis, is now as focused on its development mandate. And I think that grew out of the fact that it's hard when you're thinking about the populations that we work with, whether it's CARE or some of the work we're doing now, those same populations are very likely to also have crisis situations from time to time. And so, the development, whether if you're committed to a community, then you need to be committed to them, whether it is in a crisis stage or it's in the long-term stage. It's also important to realize that if we can put more into preparedness and prevention, that a lot of those crises will have a lesser impact. And so, as an example, when I was at CARE and we were working on a lot of the issues related to food insecurity, particularly during crises, we were able to show demonstratively that countries that we worked with on food security from a development standpoint were the same countries who rebounded more rapidly when there was an immediate food crisis from drought, famine, or even human conflict. So we know that. We know that if we look at the work in climate change and looking at helping populations adapt to the impact of climate change, if you can shift people's livelihoods so that they're more suited to intermittent crisis, climate occurrences like drought or flooding, that you can in fact make those populations more sustainable. We have one that people often remember, this little vignette. We were working in Bangladesh, for instance, where cyclones have become much more frequent as a result of climate change, and we worked with populations to be able to shift their income generating work. And one simple one was taking people who use chickens as their economic engine, growing chickens, selling eggs, et cetera, and shifted to ducks, because chickens will drown, but ducks float. So, a simple thing like moving from chickens to ducks in areas where there were frequent cyclones and flooding meant that you had people whose whole income streams weren't wiped out every time there was this sort of crisis situation. So I think those kind of simple ways of learning how to adapt will mean that when crises do occur, people are much more likely to withstand them. And again, that's where that continuum between development and humanitarian response, I think, is so important to keep in mind.
I guess sometimes innovation is just recognizing what Mother Nature has already done for us.
Exactly.
Maybe if I can stick with you, could you tell us more about this new venture and what it represents in terms of a new model and approach to thinking about particularly the nonprofit role in development?
Yeah, so the McKinsey, the global consulting firm, decided about a year or so ago that they really wanted to look at, they do a lot of social impact work for clients, but really looking at a more purely philanthropic way. How can they use their assets to be able to give back and make broader contributions to society and perhaps have greater focused impact? And with the real sense that today's solutions are no longer primarily going to be in one sector or the other. And just as you talked about the development agencies now becoming a minority partner, we recognize development funding is different, who the actors are very different, and that a firm that is firmly rooted with very strong ties to the private sector, very strong ties to public sector, and also the not-for-profit sector could really bring together solutions that were perhaps different than the traditional solutions where we had those kind of stovepipe approaches to solving problems. And so the McKinsey Social Initiative is really all about how do you bring these kinds of partnerships, these kind of tri-sector collaboratives together to be able to develop different kinds of solutions to problems. And you mentioned the issue of youth and youth unemployment. One of the first programs that we launched is a program on youth employment. It's now in 5 different countries, the US, Mexico, Spain, India, and Kenya, and really looking at the reality that there are so many young people who want to be employed but don't have the skills. A lot of employers who say that they can't find enough skilled entry-level workers, matching those together, giving young people the skills, but also working on the employer side. And so we've reached out to the private sector so that we have employers working with civil society organizations that do training for young people, and working with the public sector that often sets some of the policies around where are the areas that are most important for their locality for young people in jobs. And we've launched this program. We now have trained and placed over 10,000 young people, and we expect to be to 30,000 and hopefully 100,000 over the next couple of years, finding high return on investment. Employers are now willing to actually pay for those programs. And really by bringing together all these sectors, I think we're at least putting a dent in one of the big global problems of youth employment, a problem that we know is only going to continue to increase.
And I know you have a fan in Eric in this program we were talking about.
Yeah.
So.
Well, USAID is actually a funder of the program, so we're very pleased to have the partnership with USAID.
Yeah, I mean, basically they use the skill set of McKinsey and those relationships to first understand what is the situation, and they basically scoured the planet for where are models where this could work in a very cost-effective way at scale. And in my view is USAID's historical approach to doing this stuff has had many successes, but the cost per student was too high, and it wasn't replicable, and it wasn't leading, in all cases, to this direct connection to jobs. So I feel like this is a huge effort at scale that if it succeeds, we will want to take all those learnings and imbue that into everything that we're doing, and that's why we're supporting this and following it closely.
And just one other thing, sorry, I'll let you go on, but I think the role of technology has also been huge in the ability to replicate and scale. And we haven't talked specifically yet about the role that technology can play in development, but I think it is one of, back to being optimistic, I think it's one of the things that makes me very optimistic when we see all the technologic advances that are helping to really leapfrog development in many ways, and it's something that really has helped us to scale this program very rapidly.
That's great. Okay, go ahead, Craig. I'm coming to you next, but on a different
Sure, I was
topic.
going to say simply that one thing that the SDGs make clear is that the financing requirements are huge, and no one organization is going to meet them. And it's imperative, therefore, that we cooperate with one another. I think that the initiatives that Helene and Eric have just described are really exciting. I mean, I've gotten to know them just in the past few years since returning to Washington. But I hate to use a surfing analogy, but we've seen a lot of waves of development, at least in my lifetime, sort of come and go. But I think this is a good wave coming up, and I'm pushing ADB hard to ride it. I think we're still looking at it and asking ourselves, what are we getting into here? Because it's really a sea change that we're talking about in terms of the way that we could work and our partners with whom we work. And in the end, whether ideas, when it comes to meeting some of the development challenges that we're up against, are as important, more important than the financing that we're making available.
So Craig, let me stick with you and with your institution and more broadly the Multilateral Development Bank. So I think it's hard, particularly in the midst of the Brexit discussions. It's hard to remember back and think about how much of the sort of existential hand-wringing was occurring around the creation of this new Multilateral Development Bank well over a year ago, and the events that played out, particularly here in Washington, and the U.S. reaction to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But there really was a sense of almost crisis occurring, particularly for the United States in its approach to the MDBs. I think a lot of that has calmed down. I think we're now moving forward with the more prosaic issues of standing up a new institution in Beijing. But nonetheless, I think it's useful to think about the AIB, particularly through a development lens, because we certainly, during that period of drama, plenty of discussion around what it meant for the U.S. strategically, diplomatically, those kinds of issues. But if we bring it back to what these institutions actually do, the ADB, the AIIB, the World Bank here, as development actors, can you talk a little bit more, particularly in the Asian context, about why the AIIB matters, what it was responding to? Infrastructure is in the name. I think by all accounts, for the next 5 to 10 years, it will be an infrastructure development bank. What is that agenda all about? Why does the AIIB matter? How is ADB itself adapting to try to respond more effectively to what we would call the infrastructure imperative, really, for development?
Sure. In a 2009 report, ADB estimated that the infrastructure needs of Asia and the Pacific totaled about $8.3 trillion. $8 trillion for domestic, $300 billion for regional infrastructure. To sustain the current levels of growth and development that we're seeing, that works out to about $750 billion a year. And if you look at what ADB is providing to the region, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what's required. If you look at what is provided for development internationally, regionally, locally, by multilaterals, bilaterals, the civil society, by governments, by private investors, globally, it's still addressing only about 16% of Asia's infrastructure needs. Just to give you some idea of the amount of resources that are required to address what we see across the region today. Pollution, water pollution, air pollution, traffic, mass transit needs, hospitals, schools, and I could just run on down the list. So ADB and the World Bank and USAID and JICA and JBIC and others, we're simply not providing the resources that, and neither are governments or private investors, to what's required to make much of a dent in the infrastructure challenge. I think ADB has gone so far as to call it an infrastructure crisis. AIB, therefore, is a welcome addition to the need for infrastructure. They're capitalized, or their subscribed capital is $100 billion. Their paid-in capital over 5 years will be about $20 billion. ADB's paid-in capital over the last 50 years is $7 billion. So the fact that's what is used to borrow in international markets. We leverage that assistance to provide support for our member countries. So AIB is going to make a real dent in terms of what's going on out there. And I think ADB's hope is that we'll be able to work closely with them in these formative stages. We signed an MOU for a roadway project in Pakistan last week. We'll be co-financing it with AIB and DFID. And there are possibilities for more projects coming up this year. And at least initially, I think we'll be co-financing a lot of projects together using ADB's rules and regulations, safeguards, what have you. And ADB will assume, major responsibility for implementing these projects. But at the same time, AIB will be developing the capacity to identify and implement these projects on their own. And at that stage, I think tables may well turn. Unless ADB gets a capital increase, I think it's likely that AIB's financial wherewithal will exceed that of ADB early on. But the concerns of last year about AIB and what it meant for the region, I mean, ADB provides $17 billion of our own funds and $10 billion more per year in financial assistance to the region, $27 billion total. I think there was and 80% of that amount is for infrastructure. And by that I mean transport, energy, irrigation, those sorts of investments. And so the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank looked in many ways like something that ADB is doing. But I can say, having been in these meetings, especially since Jin Li-chun, AIB's president, my former boss, he was vice president of ADB for 5 years. I think the aim of both institutions is to work closely together in parallel on things, if not actual commingling of finances. And I think AIB has every intention of living up to the safeguards, which we all think are so important. And I think they're going to be a good partner in development assistance moving forward.
So everything you say, and I actually want to pause. I wanted to do this earlier, and frankly I forgot, but to use the prerogative of the moderator to do a little bit of advertising for my organization, because the Center for Global Development actually used the opportunity of all the attention at the time of the AIB's creation to stand up its own high-level panel on the future of the multilateral development banks. That group has been working very actively over the course of the past year, and will be issuing a report with recommendations very soon in the months ahead. So I just encourage you all to look for that. I'm excited about it. I think we've brought together a very good group of actors who've brought their thinking and voices to this sort of big picture question of the MDBs. But so that's that. But back to this question, everything you've described suggests that really, when you boil it down, the AIB is really about bringing more capital to what everyone agrees is a pressing development need, and to the degree that we either worry or would hope for a different kind of model from the Chinese, maybe we're not going to see it here. They have a particular need in the near term to co-finance with ADB, with World Bank, just as a matter of basic capacity. And they've committed themselves to a set of rules and standards that look a lot like the MDBs. So I wonder, and this is a question for all three of you actually, if we think about emerging powers in development, sovereigns, country powers, the Chinese in particular, are they representing a different model for development? We've put a lot into this new institution, and I think, again, as time goes on, we kind of look at it more closely and say, well, actually, kind of looks a lot like the ADB. There's really not that much different here. But beyond that one institution, how should we think about whether it's the Chinese approach to development in the developing world outside of its own borders? Does it cause us sitting here in Washington to have to think differently about our own approaches institutionally as development actors, et cetera? Or can we simply welcome the additional amount of capital that is flowing as a result of emerging markets themselves becoming wealthier? Any one of you?
I don't have to start each one.
Huh?
I won't start each one.
Well, you're sitting in a development agency, but I mean, I guess I would say, I think overall it's a good thing. More money for development is a good thing. That said, I think that the more we're able to strengthen countries' capacity to really be at the core of making sure they are the leaders in how development funds are spent, I think it's less a matter of whether or not what China is doing is changing U.S. official development funds or not, but more, are we all strengthening the country's ability to influence how resources are used? And I think until that happens, there will still be the kind of the chaos that exists. I also think we, as we've said throughout, more and more different kinds of actors are in there. I think the role of the private sector. I think the role of things like remittances. So, there's so many different flows now that I don't think we can think about it as simplistically as we did before. But at the core of it, I think the more countries are strengthened to be able to really be in the lead, the better all of this will be.
It's the Bretton Woods annual meeting. I'd be remiss not to say that policies and institutions matter. And I think when it comes to infrastructure needs in area, the finance is one thing, but one only has to look at the experiences of Japan and Korea and Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore to see that they had their policies and institutions right, and frankly didn't require a whole lot of support from us to achieve the level of success that they've realized today. And if more countries across the region were to work on their legal and regulatory environments, their foreign investment codes, their judicial systems, so that there's accountability and transparency and predictability to what's going on, then they probably wouldn't be having some of the problems they're having today with foreign investors coming in and the fact that some public-private partnerships are not getting off the ground as quickly as they might. So that's the way I'd answer the question. Finance is one thing. Bankable projects is a whole different story.
And I'd say that we are constantly looking at our model to figure out. We're always on the lookout for good ideas. And it doesn't matter really where they come from. It's not restricted to China. It can come from some startup in Silicon Valley or some local community in remote Uganda or anywhere else. So we're constantly looking because the situation keeps changing, and we have big goals to try to reach. So we need every good idea from wherever it comes. And I would just simply say that also that that's true for everyone, including the Chinese. I mean, we have a strategic dialogue, development dialogue with the Chinese. My boss, Gayle Smith, the head of USAID, was in Beijing in the last month, meeting with senior officials there, talking about concrete projects and talking about also general development architecture type issues. And they made clear and described some of the ways in which they're evolving. It's very early days for them. They don't have 50 years worth of experience. They don't have staff who have worked in it for that long, or the numbers of staff. And so it's going to be a constant evolution, whether with regards to the intersection of our work with China's, but also our work with everybody else's.
So let me ask one last question before I turn to the audience, and frankly, more political in nature. And I want to note that, Eric, you have a particular responsibility as a administration official here. But frankly, I think all of us on this stage are probably U.S. voters and taxpayers. So, we do have to think about this issue of how the electorate is feeling these days when it comes broadly to questions of globalization, but particularly the role that our enterprise plays of development. What is the receptivity in this area? Nobody's going to campaign on this issue, of course, but elections will have consequences when it comes to pursuing the kinds of agendas that we want to pursue. And specifically, I guess the question is this. I would argue that when it comes to political support, and on a bipartisan basis, when we talked about foreign assistance historically, to the degree could be characterized as a charitable function, that we are doing direct poverty alleviation, we are helping with disease eradication. There's always been a core of support there in our electorate. It is becoming more of a challenge as we broaden the scope of activities. And if you look at the SDGs, which is a universal exercise, there's a lot on that list that I think your average taxpayer would say, I would like some of that for myself. Do you see a challenge here, and how are we adapting and making the case to our taxpayers? This is a particular responsibility for you, Eric, in your current role. But I wonder if any of you have thoughts on, are we seeing a rising tension? Is this something that actually maybe development remains under the radar, or it's something we have to confront?
So, it's a constant discussion that has gone on for decades with American taxpayers. And there are some ebbs and flows to it. As you suggest, one pillar of the work of our agency has incredible support from around the United States, because Americans are very generous at times of humanitarian crisis, and there's widespread support. If anything, criticism of, can't you go faster to help solve this humanitarian crisis or that? I think increasingly there is one thing that has made it easier in terms of the discussion about the development parts of the enterprise, because I think, in my personal opinion, you could go back to the Cold War days, and reasonable people might justifiably say, we don't really care about country X. It's not geopolitically important to us. They are trapped in a terrible cycle of bad governance and terrible development indicators and everything. It's in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't matter to us. It's not a priority, because we do want to do these things domestically that you mentioned. So basically, let's ignore it, as long as they vote with us maybe in the UN when it's Soviet Union, United States. I don't think as many Americans have that same view these days, because they've seen what happens if you don't have a good global health systems architecture, and someone comes down with Ebola in remote West Africa, and 24 hours later, they're in the Dallas hospital, right? So I think more and more people are, the globalization discussion, which has many, many facets, but in the area of development, as I go around the United States, more and more people, when you get into a discussion about, they realize that there's basically no spot left on the planet where you can just let it fester. And of course, if you're having the discussion about national security and terrorism, it's the same thing. We can't have these places that are just, where things fester. So I think from that point of view, new dialogues are possible and new understandings. And you see a lot of bipartisan collaboration. I mean, amidst everything else going on, it would be completely understandable if the following wasn't on people's radar screens, but actually on a bipartisan basis. Congress passed a bill about Power Africa. There is one getting very close to passage involving Feed the Future. And there are at least 2 others with people working across the aisle on bills which the president has or probably will sign. And that shows that, that people do see that we need to have development as one of those 3 Ds that the Bush administration described, development, defense, diplomacy. And we've got 150 generals working with USGLC who passionately feel that way. And so I think the conversation's never simple, especially when you have such misinformation. You know, the annual Kaiser poll, where they go around and ask Americans, how much do you think you're spending on foreign assistance out of your tax dollar? And the average response is 20%, when it's the reality that everything, including consular affairs and all that, is under 1%. You know, we have to keep having the dialogue, but there are new ways to have the dialogue these days than in the past.
That's great. It's encouraging to hear that. Helene, Craig?
Yeah, yeah. Again, this is one where I'm probably kind of bipolar. I'm sometimes optimistic and sometimes very pessimistic about it. And adding to your Kaiser poll data, not only do people think that we're spending, 20, 25% on foreign aid, whatever quote foreign aid is, which I think people don't really understand what that means, and we're spending less than 1%. If you ask them what we should be spending, they'll say 10%. I would love to have 10% to spend on development aid. And my optimism is in seeing some of the things that you talked about. A lot of the work that I've done over the years in global health, for instance, as you said. I mean, people will give to global health. People believe that it's wrong for people to die from malaria, from HIV, malnutrition, et cetera. That's very tangible. It's very concrete. If you ask people about funding governance initiatives, you get into a different, sort of dialogue. But when when I was at CARE, we used to have every day our lobby day, every year our lobby day, where we had volunteers, and there would be people from across the United States, usually 45 to 50 states represented, anywhere from 500 to 1 year 2,000 people who came, paid their own way, just so that they could come and be able to be a voice for these issues on Capitol Hill. And to see this crowd of people who represent a broad swath of America, learning about these issues and feeling like they really want to make a difference in helping our elected officials understand why these issues matter to everyday people. So I can come out of that hugely optimistic. On the other hand, that there's a large swath of the public who really feel very, very differently, and I think that's come out in this election period in very strong and very disturbing ways, that in fact everybody doesn't understand our obligation, our commitment to the rest of the world, and why it matters even for their own individual lives. And I think we've got to do a better job of being able to paint the connections and help people to understand why it really does matter and why it isn't just charity. But I think when you, as you said, once you get beyond some of these very tangible things like education and health, et cetera, I think you do have a much harder job. And you talk about governance, and people think you're out planning coups in different countries or what have you. They just don't get some of the more intangible or underlying cause issues that we deal with in development.
So actually, I'm going to pause there because I've neglected the audience too long. So let me go. We have time for a handful of questions, I think. This young woman here, we'll start with her.
Hi, Hi, my name is Hong Zhang. I'm a PhD student at George Mason University. So my question mainly goes to Mr. Steffensen. So you have talked about AIIB in terms of being a positive addition to the global development, but we're seeing some Chinese practice in parallel to these multilateral initiatives, which is the Chinese policy banks, especially the Export and Import Bank of China, is very actively funding infrastructure projects all over the world. And I don't know about the numbers, but it might have surpassed many of the multilateral banks. So how do you see this practice is affecting the ecosystem of global development? What kind of impact does it have? Thank you.
Why don't we pick up, say, 2 more questions, and maybe we'll have time for another round right here in front. Just wait a second for the mic.
Thank you. Hiltner at George Mason University and formerly of ADB. I also have a question for Craig. You mentioned the shortage of bankable projects. So what is the ADB's concept of a bankable project as compared to the AIIB? Is there a difference in how they view risk, and if you can't directly address that, I'm just wondering if you can be more explicit about what the criteria is of the ADB for determining whether a project is bankable. Thank you.
So Craig, why don't you answer those questions together, and then we'll go to another round of questions.
Sure. I think you're referring to a recent article in the Financial Times that said that China Exim and China Development Bank combined provide more resources for development and trade than the multilateral development banks as we know them combined. And I guess you want to know how what I think of their role and whether or not it's a good thing.
Yeah, their impact, how they are changing the dynamics of the marketplace in the sense that how these developing countries, when they pursue infrastructure, how do they approach these different entities?
Yeah, I think, and here I'm really sort of reading between the lines. This is nothing that my management nor AIB has ever said. But I think that my former boss, Jin-Li Chun, he has pretty broad experience in World Bank and ADB. And I think he was concerned about what China was doing in the name of development, given what we were all reading in the papers a few years ago. And he was concerned about it because he thought that China could do a better job. And I think AIB is in part a way of sort of funneling resources that would otherwise be made available for development by China through a multilateral development bank to ensure that these same investments are guided by the same safeguards related to the environment and procurement and resettlement and gender and community participation. Sort of the aspects of project development that the multilateral development banks believe are important, sacrosanct. And for China to develop the capacity to process projects the same way, even to exceed what we're doing. I think that's his hope. And I think he also wanted to get things done faster. I know he wants to get things done faster than what we're currently doing. We take about 2 to 3 years to get a project to our board for consideration and another 6 or 7 years to implement it. And I think there are concerns around the world that that's just not fast enough. And so he'll be, at least for the foreseeable future, working in tandem with ADB and the World Bank and other IFIs, using our procurement rules and regulations and our implementation requirements and monitoring arrangements, and AIIB will develop the capacity, I believe, in a short time to do things the same way we do. And then it's anyone's guess what happens. I think they're free at that point to sort of do things their own way, to improve upon what we've set in place and maybe to exceed what we're doing. but otherwise to get into the marketplace, some level of competition, if you will, because our resources are needed, sure, but I think the countries the borrowers are going to start judging us according to our ability to get things done in ways that are responsible and efficient. And so I think the role of AIB in response to your question has been positive to the environment in the infrastructure realm in that part of the world because it's introduced a new dynamic to what's being provided.
And the question of bankable projects?
Bankable projects, yeah, I thought I sort of addressed that. It goes beyond financial and economic rates of return and doing things by the book. But I think that bankable refers to investment codes that are bankable, to bankruptcy and other forms of investor protection, laws that people can rely upon, access to arbitration in the courts in ways that risk management committees in corporations and others that are thinking about investing in a place are okay with. Everyone remembers the experience of '97 and more recently in 2008 when a lot of investors got burned, and it's hard for them to carry the same projects to their boards today that they could then without lots of assurances. And I think that everyone has to sort of up their game when it comes to the software-related issues to these projects before they're going to get approved.
Yeah, let's try to get, we have time for another round, so let's try to get 3 or 4, start here, and then we'll move over here. So right up front.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Courtney Vaughan. My question probably will expand on the 2 that were asked earlier in the context of risk. Is there any concern for the type of infrastructure investment that China is making cross-border in countries that are probably vulnerable, especially when one looks at critical infrastructure, which normally countries like the United States do not allow foreign government to invest in, since it's not necessarily the Chinese private sector that's investing in these infrastructure? That's one question. And the second question is on the bankable business plan. From the US and a number of projects, I'm an investment banker, economist, World Bank, Wall Street, and I've looked at, evaluated a number of projects that come out of African countries. And I know USAID is there, and you have brought in a number of transaction advisors, right, in recent years to help, even with the Power Africa projects. Now, it seems to me that there needs to be some education on the US side as to what US private sector companies look for, investors look for, what incentivizes them, that sort of thing. Because we're looking at greenfield projects in most cases, so it's a power as a greenfield project. And oftentimes, even in the United States, there are certain incentives that the government would actually provide to investors here, right, that one can't consider cross-border. So other than the typical cross-border risk, et cetera, that one has to look at, among other things, I think that there's a lack of education as to really what US investors are looking for and how even taxation drives investors in the US.
Okay, so I'm going to try very quickly. We'll go here to Whitney and then 2 more here. And then I'll just ask the panelists to make their responses, their concluding remarks. So go ahead, and then we'll pick these 2 up.
Whitney Debevoise, Myrtleton Porter. It may be the case that we have an interesting moment to reflect on setting up multilateral institutions, because we have the AIIB, we have the New Development Bank, and we have the Green Climate Fund. AIIB, the initial concern was not enough focus on safeguards. The Green Climate Fund seems to take the view that they have their own safeguards, but then they only work through implementing agencies, and the World Bank and the Asian Development Banks aren't good enough, or they have to be done twice or something, which is going to lead to inefficiencies. But again, that's a UN organization. It's not weighted voting, and sort of a paralyzed board and so forth. But what lessons can we learn here from these three startup institutions as we think about the development process?
Okay, and very quickly, I'll ask both of you just very short questions right here.
Yeah, Joe Marie Griesgraber again. And Helene, I'm going to put you on the spot. I apologize. You're doing great work through McKinsey, but I'm also reading reports that McKinsey has been facilitating illicit or, shall we call it, gray money outside from developing and developed countries into tax havens. And is there a conversation within McKinsey on consistency across its work in support of development?
Last question right here.
I'll try not to ask a zinger like that. Bob Berg, World Academy of Art and Science. What I'm concerned about is that that our field of international development had as its fundamental rationale the elimination of the worst forms of poverty, and now the bank says that those under the under the poverty line are less than 10% and declining. So I'm wondering whether you see the need to bolster the rationale for development more towards in the spirit of the SDGs, of mutual interest, of creating growth for our own markets, and whether there is more to what's going on in your work that is of domestic benefit, as you mentioned in the employment creation, that could lead to a broader justification.
Okay, 1 minute each. Answer what you like, ignore what you like. Please, so we'll go down the row.
So quickly on two of them. On Power Africa, the whole concept of the transaction advisors, which is something that I introduced as the 5 or 6 of us put this together, was based on my Citibank experience, where I felt like we had people who get up every morning and go to sleep every night just thinking about how do they get the deals done. And that's a concept that applies when you're the minority partner. And of course, the countries in some cases do not have the standards or the processes or the laws or whatever it might be in some cases that facilitate the flow of private capital. And that's part of what private sector was telling us they needed, right? Yes, they want some risk mitigation and capital to mitigate risk. Yes, they want investment, but they want also the engagement of U.S. ambassadors and senior U.S. people, as well as these people on the ground, to be working with the governments to make the changes necessary so that some modest portion of that huge wall of capital that's sitting out there, in some cases at negative interest rates, but is looking for a return. So agree, and that's part of what the transaction advisors and all the different agencies involved from the U.S. government side are about. And then I would say to Bob's question, I don't think the U.S. government has a policy per se about the point that you raised. My personal opinion is that all the development agencies and banks, aside from the humanitarian function, ought to be working ourselves out of the job. So we ought to make progress on these extreme poverty and SDG things, and then at that point, let the countries do it for themselves. That's why DRM is so important, and let us go out of business, as we've done in dozens of countries already. Graduation.
On the question you raised about McKinsey, first, McKinsey's social initiative is a NGO that is not directly part of McKinsey, so I may not have all of the information about, but I think you're talking about this investment group that is also somewhat a separate part from McKinsey itself. I think the article that came out in the Financial Times didn't have all of the facts, and I think made more of a link than is actually there, but I honestly can't answer all of the information. Be happy to provide you with names if you want to get more information about some of it. I think they feel very comfortable that the business is being transacted in a fair, transparent way and is not abusing developing country money in any way. So, and just also on your question, I agree. I think that we should be thinking about putting ourselves out of business. And when I was at CARE, we had the opportunity to see several countries that graduated, if you will, and became self-sufficient, and that really should be our job. I also think that more and more companies that we worked with, particularly multinational companies, global companies, that we're seeing that their future revenues were going to come from emerging markets, really started thinking in very different ways about their responsibilities to the countries in which they were hoping to have future markets. And it was also a way of being able to talk about how American jobs were being created, because as they were actually doing things that made a difference to develop those communities, they were actually building their businesses. And so I think we can make the case for how continuing to invest in development goals will continue to also enable businesses, American businesses, to grow as they move more and more into emerging markets.
Last word, Craig.
Not going to get in the way of lunch here, but 3 quick points. First, I've spent 33 years in development, and I know how much our assistance is appreciated in the field. It still is. And for my part, I can't wait to get out of bed in the morning every day to keep working on this area. 1. 2, since coming back to Washington a few years ago, I'm just amazed with the debate that takes place in this town when it comes to development on a daily basis. There are more seminars and roundtables and things like this that are just providing constant feedback to policymakers and planners, as to what's needed. And I think we're pretty good at making course corrections and adjustments, so that we remain relevant. And third, this is a related point. I'd just like to acknowledge the efforts of Scott and the Center for Development in supporting a proposal by ADB last year to merge our concessional and ordinary capital resources, which allows us to boost our support for development by 50% beginning next year. We're talking 50% more loans and 70% more grants. There was a fair amount of financial engineering involved, but it was cost-free to our donors. And with things like that are still possible to be done, I just think that we're making it easy for our donors to support us, and I hope there isn't a whole lot of questioning anywhere about our ability to do what's necessary to help out. Thanks.
Okay, on that note, please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you all very much, and thank you, panel, for a wonderful discussion on a topic that left us with a lot of optimism. And 3 quick points before we leave. Thank you to all of you for staying and for offering your respect and being conscientious with your good questions. You're wonderfully patient, and I want to say thanks again to our sponsors, SICPA Holdings and Soros Fund Management this year, as well as IMF partners, and obviously our Secretariat staff out there who really put this program together. And finally, we do have a reception right outside there if you're willing to stay for a little bit of discussion. Hope to hear from you and talk a little bit more. Thank you very much.